One of the biggest surprises from McFarlane in their most recent episode livestream was the unveiling of another collector's edition 2-pack in the form of Merciless and Batman Who Laughs coming together with brand new deco and revitalization, and this kind of got me wondering, even though we've already gotten these figures before, they're kind of being brought back in a new light, and most importantly, it's getting people who missed out on their initial runs a second chance of owning them. And I kind of wanted to make this very thematic, albeit a little lengthy video to not only catch up on some of those 2-packs and reissues that I've sort of missed and been a little behind on covering on the channel, but also kind of connect them all together via a very common theme, which is the season of reissues from McFarlane Toys for DC Multiverse, especially since it looks like allegedly the license might finally be vacating from McFarlane Toys, and I feel like this is kind of like this very interesting window where McFarlane decided to strategize and go, well, let me kind of go back to the drawing board before I completely lose the option to be able to do this in the first place and give collectors a second chance of getting at some of these figures. Okay, let's start off with the collector's edition 2-pack that I kind of been behind on because this was allegedly a GameStop exclusive at one point, but then after a while it started trickling into Target stores, and then I didn't know exactly what was going on with it anymore, and by the time that I kind of rolled around with it, got it shipped in. An awful lot of other releases that I think had a little bit more attention turned on them, and then eventually the Superman movie stuff started dropping and started making its way towards stores and getting shipped in. So many things started to kind of fluctuate that I kind of felt a little behind on this specific 2-pack. And what also kind of drew my attention a little bit is because ultimately it's this collector's edition 2-pack that was hammering home across the point that I was kind of mentioning towards the intro of this video, which is that this series is more or less developing a bit of a running theme of giving people who missed out initial runs of a figure, whether they were singular releases or 2-packs or much more holy grails to that extent, a second turnaround, a second opportunity to get those figures, albeit with some creative choices and also some betterment of technologies and practices that were definitely a little antiquated for when McFarlane started to churn out the DC Multiverse stuff. Especially when you're dealing with what many could consider a holy grail amongst holy grail figures, that's going to be the Grim Knight Batman figure. If you guys are not familiar with the Grim Knight, he's meant to be, as dictated by his bio, the second most deadliest Batman in the multiverses of Batman that are out there, because this is the guy. This is the guy that is not afraid to pull the trigger. He says, screw all that as far as the whole no killing rule, my morals, my ethics, etc. No, I'm here to get shit done. Pretty much Punisher Batman is essentially what he is. And so when McFarlane tackled that figure, it was definitely up their wheelhouse because I feel like there's a little bit of cross-pollination happening with McFarlane's own creation in the form of Spawn, as far as utilizing weapons, machine guns, rifles, etc., all that good stuff. As far as also the stuff that they like to do as far as the texture and the molding and the sculpting of the body in regards to like armor, buckles, straps, you name it. So this is a figure that was ultimately going to be amongst the first that McFarlane really wanted to get out there. Unfortunately, it managed to also garner the attention of WB, and that's kind of what we started to see the snowball effect of the whole no guns rule amongst the figures, not only for McFarlane, but just for practically any Warner Brothers DC property. So pretty surprising that all these years later, especially on the sunsetting of the DC license, Grim Knight makes a return in this specific collector's edition 2-pack, thus garnering the 17 plus label that you see on the box. And effectively, it is in fact a reissue of the same figure. So if you do manage to come across the original Grim Knight standalone release, or if you already have him in your collection, this guy is going to definitely feel a whole lot at home in terms of familiarity. The sculpting is the same. Not much I can really deduce as far as changes to the actual texture work and, like I mentioned, the molding, the sculpting, and the majority, keyword there, the majority of the suit and the figure in and of itself is sculpted pretty much identical. The only obvious takeaway is going to be that recency bias as far as the texture feeling a little bit cleaner, feeling a bit more cohesive with each other, and not feeling as kind of strung together or wobbly like it was from the get-go. You can tell that they probably changed their printer heads as far as getting these things printed and mass-produced right out of the factory. Now, tackling probably the most obvious change here would have to be a bit of the color scheming, because you'll notice that he's not completely all black like he was in his original run. This time, he's a bit more on the grayish side as far as the bulk of his suit. It's meant to be a bit more on the smokier gray as opposed to just being a completely all-washed black like the original release. And you'll also notice that it's got much more of a hazy, smokier, mattier finish to the chrome paint on the bat symbol, which is pretty much identical to that of the original. It even has one ear being a little shorter than the other, but I'm a little bit more partial to the glossier nature of the bat symbol on the original, and that's ultimately what's really going to come down to with the Grim Knight re-release here, is that it's going to lean more towards subjectivity as far as which one you kind of prefer. When it comes to the objective details, yeah, the Grim Knight from this specific 2-pack is arguably going to be better as far as certain things that they managed to refine on, as far as, like I mentioned, the texture work happening on the shoulders, the biceps, the majority of the tactical suit feeling just a little bit more refined. And I'll go as far as to say that I appreciate the brown aesthetic to some of the straps happening alongside the chest here that look a bit more natural and lifelike versus the all black look to the original. In fact, you even have some more touches and accents of chrome happening on those buckles in the center that kind of complete the entirety of the ensemble and kind of focus your attention to the middle part of the figure that looks much more appealing. And while your eyes are drawn to that attention, you also notice that they overhauled the head sculpt a little bit. For the most part, it's sculpted the same as far as the cowl is concerned, but obviously you'll note that the expression is changed up a little bit differently. And to remain objective, the practices or the actual sculpting of the overall look is arguably a little bit better. You can note that the sculpting for the actual expression around the eyes is a little bit much more refined, and more importantly, the mouth plate doesn't look like it's just grafted on there, because that's one thing that I will definitely criticize the original Grim Knight head sculpt, is that the mouth plate looks like it's practically going to come apart because of the very obvious separation of the seams between the skin tone and the rest of the cowl. And that's one thing that they could have touched up on, even though it's not meant to be like loose, it's not coming apart or anything like that, but the years have not exactly been all that friendly to the original Grim Knight. Whereas over here, despite still being a little on the fence as far as the brace look that he's got going on for the Grimace, I understand that they were trying to give it this effect to make it look like it's separated teeth, but I don't know if it's translated very well. Still, it's an expression that feels a bit more refined, and the mouth plate is applied a bit more, like I mentioned before, naturalist versus the way that it looks like on the original. Apart from that, though, like I said, it really just it boils down to which one do you prefer, the much more smokier, grayer aesthetic to this brand new Grim Knight, or the all-black aesthetic. Personally, I kind of prefer the all-black, especially since you're dealing with some nicer, slightly patina, slightly kind of, I don't know what color to call it, but it's kind of like, it's got a little bit of a chrome finish to the gauntlets and the knee pads, especially with the little bat symbol sculpted on top of it. But I just like the look of these specific parts to the suit a little better than just the all-black versions on the Grim Knight, despite still keeping a little bit of that paint application on the spikes on the gauntlets, but then the rest of the gauntlets just all black, and it just kind of falls a little bit on the generic side. Everything else, though, ideally the same. Articulation is practically the same, and you can kind of take that as both a good thing and a bad thing, because arguably we're still dealing with some antiquities as far as the articulation and the tooling is concerned from back in the late 2020s, early 2021 days. And then the accessories, whether it be the back piece that you're supposed to apply to the back, that's a little difficult to do on the new Grim Knight. I don't know if it's a QC problem, but the little peg, the hole between the back of the figure and the straps is a little misaligned as far as the assembly. So getting the peg from the back piece that has all of the weaponry molded and grafted onto itself is a little difficult to fit in on the brand new Grim Knight as opposed to the original. So that's a little confusing that is the case, but the rest of the armaments, as far as the grenade launcher and the submachine gun, completely identical. So at that point, if you want to dress them up even further, you have to rely on the munitions pack, because this is probably as lenient as WB was able to do in modern times. And when it comes to the color scheming, despite the very objective improvements as far as sculpting, paintwork, and all that good stuff, it really just boils down to preference. As far as the costume skin, you truly do prefer. On the opposite side of the spectrum, I can wholeheartedly tell you that I prefer the classic look of the Killer Croc that he comes bundled with, as opposed to the inspiration that it's kind of stemming down from, which would have to be the Arkham Asylum Killer Croc mega figure. Yeah, this is probably gonna be an example that I'm gonna be utilizing when it comes to how a toy company should definitely take an existing figure and kind of retool it and repaint it in a way that, despite still knowing that it's heavily lifting from a prior existing figure and can constitute as a repaint or rehash, whatever you want to call it, it still kind of evokes a feeling of newness. And I got that feeling from this brand new Killer Croc, which was completely unexpected, because when I saw him from the promo photos when this 2-pack was originally revealed, my first instinct was to say that's simply just the Arkham Asylum Killer Croc mega figure repainted and repackaged. And I'm thinking to myself, he's probably going to be the least appealing part of this whole entire 2-pack. And frankly, I think he ends up being my favorite out of the two, which is like crazy considering that this 2-pack comes with, again, one of the holy grails that people are often looking for in the form of Grim Knight. Because to make sure that we're dealing with what could be considered as a definitive Killer Croc figure, they took the Arkham Asylum version, and for the most part, you'll notice that I want to say the limbs is arguably where you're going to find the most identical traits that are simply just repainted with what is obviously going to be a much more saturated green skin color, and also the blue tint for the pants as opposed to the orange from the original Arkham Asylum prison fatigues that he's got going on for the original. Only this time, you'll notice that they kind of, like I mentioned with Grim Knight, refined a few of the methods as far as airbrushing, as far as applying some of these paint apps, and making sure that the texture feels very scaly when it comes to the way that some of the little crevices in between each scale feel on the shoulders, on the biceps, and then most specifically where you have an awful lot more of the overhaulness happening, the torso. That's arguably my favorite part, where they gave him a little bit more of that chiseling effect for the scales as far as the abdomens, the chest, and to hammer home more of that point of the feeling of newness, they sculpted some extra muscle and scaling mass to the chest and other parts of the body that arguably make this brand new Killer Croc feel a little bit bigger than even the Arkham Asylum. If I was to look at these two and someone were to hypothetically ask me which one would win in a fight, I gotta be honest, I would go with the new definitive comic-based Killer Croc over here as opposed to the Arkham Asylum one, because he looks a little slimmer. Personally, I've never really been the biggest fan as far as that bleaching effect that they added to the scales. I even mentioned this on the original review because I do happen to have his own standalone review on the channel if you guys want to go and check it out. But even in that video, I mentioned that I'm not most appreciative of the bleaching white effect to the surface of the scaling that he's got going on the chest, on the abdomen, and even more so towards the back. They completely did away with that on the brand new comic-based Killer Croc with, like I mentioned before, the overhaul to the applications on the surface of the skin and the scales, but also added new scales to broaden up a little bit of the chest, a little bit towards the back, to the point where he's got these like ridges that feel very dinosaur-like towards the top part of his trapezius, and then to kind of compensate the little extra mass that he's covered up with here on the Arkham Asylum version for the neck, where he's got the neck brace that he's being kind of leashed with some chains in the original game. They managed to even add more scale and musculature to that missing area that was completely covered up by that neck brace on the original. So they actually added more plastic to the figure. They kind of coated it on, while at the same time retaining the cohesion of the paint applications. That, to me, is something that more companies need to take into consideration instead of just taking an existing figure, repainting it, and just boxing it up. They did a little bit more than that, and it's very difficult to deny in this case when looking at them next to each other. That's brought home even further so by the obvious tell that the head sculpt has been completely overhauled to look a little bit more comic accurate. Not only is it cohesive with the paint applications, but of course you got the teeth, you got the expression, you even have one raised eyebrow that looks completely different than that of the original Arkham Asylum. The only areas that do feel a little awkward when putting them next to each other would have to be the areas around the ankles and the wrists, because those are obviously going to be covered up by these braces that he had on that original Arkham Asylum version. Whereas here, obviously they had to did away with that, so it does look a little obvious, like they just kind of grafted and extended a little bit of that plastic. So the stuff that I was kind of praising for the extra muscle and scaling that was happening on the back and on the chest and even on the a little bit around the neck area to kind of give him a much more hulking physique and presence cannot really be said too much more about the ankle area and the wrist area. Specifically the wrist area, there's something about the way that the forearms look that does look a little like something belongs there, and yet a bit of my brain it's almost like playing a practical illusion on me. And so when I see the wrist straps happening over here, feels a bit more naturalistic, but at least the trade-off would have to be the torn up parts of the pants that were then raised to again make them look a little bit much more natural to his comic book counterpart, as opposed to the way that they look like over here. Plus, never really been the biggest fan of the black nails and claws, so to see that he's got much more natural looking claws with this kind of beige airbrush kind of aesthetic to the nails and the toes is a plus for me. And so I never thought that I would be in the case of preferring the brand new as opposed to the Killer Croc from arguably one of my favorite superhero games of all time, Arkham Asylum, yet here we are. And considering that you got less braces and less things happening with this brand new version, that's going to allow the articulation, which is completely identical from that of the Asylum version, going to play out and be a bit more flexible this time around. So even though I would have preferred maybe some added accessories for Killer Croc, some kind of, maybe have the braces off to the side, make it look like he just broke like a piece of chain or something like that, this is still arguably a really compelling argument as to how to do things right as far as ReIssues is concerned, and giving people who missed out on these singular releases a second go around without having to resort to scalping prices. And even though the communication of how this guy was readily available was a little wonky, with it being first released to GameStop, and then which is how I got mine shipped in from GameStop, only to then around the same time that it got delivered, going to a Target for literally I think like groceries or something like that, and then finding it on the shelf, I still like that they're kind of readily available, whether it be to ship in from GameStop, or I would say that a good assortment of stock was sent out to brick and mortar Target stores for people to pick up. And even though the price has kind of changed with the times, I think there's enough improvements happening here to again make the case for a worthwhile pickup, if, major asterisks here, if you missed out on the original standalone releases. And again, the way that they're making things readily available is a humongous plus in this case. It's not always the case when dealing with Target exclusive gold label releases and dealing with a figure that still to this day doesn't have his own standalone release. He always comes with some form of gimmick, some kind of wrinkle, some kind of caveat. And that's unfortunately the case for the next 2-pack. Now, as a form of an intermission before we tackle the much more anticipated 2-pack to cover in this video, since it's the most recent one to get released and it's arguably the one that probably has the most eyes on it, the most attention on it as far as the action figure toy reviewer space right now, I wanted to briefly talk about this 2-pack that was mentioned to be a Target exclusive, a gold labeled exclusive to be available in Target physical stores. One that, to the extent that I even had to track down an employee to bring over from the back because it was very seldom out on the shelf. And almost just as quickly and almost just as elusive, it just practically disappeared. And right now it's practically going a little crazy in the aftermarket. And that would have to be for this gold label Dark Knight Rises 2-pack of the wired cape version of the Christian Bale Batman figure bundled in with his Batpod, because originally the only real way to get the Batpod would be bundled with the Catwoman as part of yet another release catered, or rather attributed, to the Dark Knight Rises label, which makes sense because that's Catwoman and that's where she was writing the Batpod. But we never really got a really focused version that either came with Batman himself or at least came singular as like a solo release, because it looks like now, in a very unofficial sort of way, McFarlane almost has retired standalone cycles of some kind. Remember there was a time in 2021, 2022 where we were getting an awful lot of bicycle or bipedal vehicles, like the White Knight cycle, of course, a lot of the motorcycles that were attributed to the movie-based versions of Batman, like the Pattinson Batman came with two practically, the Drifter bike and then the official Bat cycle, and then of course the Batpod from the Flash movie, etc. And then even the goddamn Joker Dragon, that was technically a vehicle. And ever since then, it's almost like McFarlane just kind of retired that series, and now the only real way to get these sort of vehicles is bundled with yet another figure in the form of either Catwoman with this guy, or at least with the Target exclusive Batman figure here, bundled in here, at a whopping price of $79.99, which at the time I definitely agree is a bit on the steep side, considering that there are some other variances of this Bale Batman out there, except I feel like to this day, there's never been a true definitive Bale Batman. And I feel like that consistency, that running gag, so to speak, is still happening, and it looks like it's going to stay that way. This is the version that came in the Ultimate 6-pack, the movie 6-pack version that I got, that unfortunately came with an upside down belt grafted onto it. And that was a major QC issue that I pointed out in that comparison video. However, what I did note in that review as well was that he came with a cloth cape, a fabric cloth cape, as opposed to being the rubberized cape, and I liked it. However, since then, we've gotten, like I said, so many variances of Bale Batman that has never felt like a very straightforward, the most definitive version of the Christian Bale Batman. There's always been some kind of gimmick, kink, and sadly, it looks like the DC license is going to exit McFarlane Toys in that manner without a true definitive standalone Bale Batman. I could be proven wrong. Maybe they'll go the route of the 89 Batman, bundling him in with accessories and whatnot. But since then, there's really no straightforward way to own Bale Batman, because his initial release with the rubberized cape came in the form of the Build the Bane wave that came with all those other figures and of course the Bane parts, therefore upticking the price a little bit. Then came this guy as part of the Ultimate Movie 6-pack. Then came the Skyhook variant without the cape and with the Christian Bale unmasked head, was the standard edition that was a Target exclusive, and then a platinum coinciding with that one was the Skyhook variant, except he had the mask and the cape, but the Skyhook, the sticky bomb gun, so it was a little inaccurate somewhat. I mean, yeah, he deploys the cape, but that's after he utilizes the gadget, that's after he takes down Lau, etc. And to add insult to the injuries that you would sustain during the toy hunts, that platinum version of the Skyhook Batman, it was released so scarcely that it almost achieves myth levels of scarcity as far as being able to physically find it in a Target store. And even when he was found online through outlets like Big Bad Toy Store, they were kind of scalping him towards being like $40 a pop, and I couldn't really justify that. And then finally, the fourth iteration is this guy, which came with that wired cape from the Skyhook variant. However, this time the cape has been replaced with a nylon fabric as opposed to the cloth fabric. So we bring forward a wire, which is very formidable, very rigid, feels good in hand, very posable, doesn't feel cheap, and is stitched along the collar line on this particular guy really well. But it's nylon. I really dislike the nylon capes. I really don't like them, especially when they're a little bit tailored to kind of drape and start to drag along the floor a little bit more than I would have liked it to, like the case is with this guy that was bundled in with the Batpod. Whereas this guy is stitched and tailored beautifully. It's made out of fabric cloth that feels a little bit more lifelike to the way that the cape looked like in The Dark Knight, but then no wire. So again, you're always constantly trading off. And the only real way to have gotten this guy is to then again hunt him down in stores, because he was never available online unless you pay scalper prices. And you have to pay a whopping $80 because he came bundled with the Batpod. And the reason for why I wanted to reserve my commentary on the Batpod is because my commentary towards the Batpod is almost identical to that of the figure itself, because if you guys were expecting any very key notable differences between what you see on the left of the screen versus what you see on the right of the screen, it's incredibly marginal. Because when it comes to Bale Batman himself, apart from the very noticeable difference that I just already covered, which is of course the wired nylon fabric cape, there's practically no difference whatsoever when it comes to the actual body itself, as far as the sculpting of the plastic, the proportions, the articulation, and even the paint apps. I would argue that maybe, just maybe, if I was to really reach, is that of course the upside down belt has since then been corrected, which obviously was going to be an isolated incident for the specific movie 6-pack that I was dealt with. But apart from that, if I was to again take a very far Mr. Fantastic reach, it would be that maybe certain areas of the body are painted a little bit much more finely on the brand new version that came bundled with the Batpod as opposed to the 6-pack version, but that's only because of recency bias. It's probably because the printers are a little bit more in tuned, it was a bit more exclusive, so they didn't have to wear down the mass production of this particular unit. And that also kind of covers envelopes the way that the head sculpt is printed as far as the paint applications, because I feel like the saturation of the skin tone on the mouth plate is a little darker than that of the original. Granted, I feel like in this certain scenario, it probably favors that the original is a bit more opaque. I feel like it looks a bit more realistic and matches Christian Bale's skin tone a little bit more accurately than the much tanner version you get on the Batpod set. So that's probably the only preferential treatment I'll give the original, is that even though the newer one looks a little cleaner, I actually kind of prefer the original one. Plus, it also has the covered up nose right underneath, whereas the brand new version, you'll notice that it's got a little bit of paint bleeding on over to the nose. It's almost like they made the nose exposed as opposed to being covered up by the mask. So it's kind of, from the front, showing a little bit of that skin tone bleed even on the nose of the mask, and I personally do not like that. Everything else, though, completely identical, not much really to write home about. There's going to be some people out there who are not going to want the Batpod, which in this case is, you guessed it, identical to the original Batpod that was released with Catwoman. As far as the sculpt work, as far as the way that everything is assembled, the way that the wheels work, everything is practically one-to-one. The only major discrepancy, or it's not even that, it's just, again, it really boils down to preference. To kind of give it an excuse to exist within the set would have to be a little bit of the wear and tear, a little bit of the battle damage and scuffness that they try to paint on top of the plastic for the brand new version, specifically around the center portion of the overall body. You'll notice that you got this like scuffing material, the scuffing pattern that they applied. It's not actual wear and tear, but rather give it that airbrushed kind of motif to make it look like it's seen a little bit of battle damage. Whereas the original is going to have a much more cleaner look. To me, I feel like this is kind of ironic, considering that if this is the one that was bundled with Catwoman, then this has to be the one that she was writing, which by that point in the movie was a little later. It's quite literally in the third act of the movie. So that this one should technically have a bit more battle damage onto itself than the original that Batman was writing either earlier in that third film, or if we were to throw it a little further back to the original Dark Knight, which finally deploys from within the tumbler itself. However, of course, the main draw about this guy is two. One would be the obvious dirt and grime that was applied to the surface of both wheels. You'll notice them being displayed right next to the original, that the wheels are obviously giving this like muddy, dirtier effect. And again, it falls down to preference. I personally prefer the cleaner look. This guy, I do like that it has kind of like a little bit of realism embedded into it, but just my personal preference, I enjoy the much darker aesthetic to the original. However, in a slight twist of fate, I kind of prefer, I really do dig the little overheating orange fiery effects that we have on the guns here at the front. I know that they're only displayed like that momentarily whenever he uses them in the latter two movies of the Dark Knight trilogy, but at the same time, it's something a little stylish and new as opposed to very generic black. Even though the original black ones over here have, again, that airbrush metallic effect, but it's kind of strange that this guy's got that metallic effect. However, this one, despite having a bit more wear and tear on the center portion of the body, doesn't have any of that airbrush behind the gun. So I thought that was a little bit of a slight inconsistency. But again, it's overshadowed and covered up by the nice, cool little fiery orange and yellow effects here at the front that gives it a little bit of a standout characteristic to this Batpod right here. It just really boils down to whether or not you really do like the Batpod and you want a 7-inch scale Batpod for your Batman from the DC Multiverse line to mount on top of. If you are very indifferent towards this particular vehicle, or you prefer the Tumbler, etc., like I said, my heart still kind of goes out to you, considering that to this day there's still no very clear directional way to pick up the Bale Batman without some kind of pack-in bundle gimmick of some kind that just it kind of inflates the price in a way that really puts into question whether or not we should have that option before the DC license runs out. And that's something that I think when it comes to these 2-packs, these reissues, needs to be taken into consideration. Especially when you make some of these reissues very scarce and very exclusive to only being found in brick and mortar stores like this set was, to the point where, again, I needed to hunt down an employee and get them from the back because they were never ever displayed. I think to this day, I never saw this set actually out in the wild. When I got mine, I needed an employee to get it out from the back. Since then, never found it in store. Contrary to the way that I've encountered the Killer Croc and Grim Knight set in physical stores or even online. And the same could also be said, a little bit more fortunately, for this last set that we're going to cover in this video. And we'll close out with probably the more attention-driven 2-pack that's currently in the market right now, because it's one of the more recently released. It was recently talked about on the McFarlane Toy Show during that live stream, and it definitely piqued my interest and made me wonder when it was going to go up. And so, kind of following suit to the last collector's edition 2-pack, it's also being distributed across only 2 retailers primarily. Only this time we're swapping Target for Walmart, but we're still keeping it up with GameStop. Frankly enough, though, I don't know what's going on in terms of any kind of like agreement that McFarlane had with Walmart, but it shipped in rather quickly, and I feel like this is also not the only recent release, or at least recent pre-order, that is getting some preferential treatment from Walmart. That's a little curious. I just hope that when it arrived, not only was it in a slightly mintier condition out of the box, but I also noticed that the packaging is foregoing any kind of collector's edition lettering. So I thought that was kind of curious that there's no lettering whatsoever on the box. It just says the names of the figures and that's it, as well as the little number to indicate that this is collector's edition 2-pack number 4. But the actual term collector's edition is nowhere to be found in the box, so I thought that was interesting. I don't know if there's like some kind of legality, as well as the 17 plus rating on the figure set, even though there's no guns to be included, as you can kind of note. But perhaps maybe it's because of the horror aesthetic to the Batman Who Laughs that's included here, as well as the demonic looking Merciless, which is meant to be Bruce Wayne, except he is pretty much bestowed with the power of Ares, which of course is an iconic Wonder Woman villain. Only this time it looks like he kind of had entanglement with Batman, and thus is resulting in this incarnation right here. Ultimately, what I think to be an apt 2-pack bundled in with the Batman Who Laughs. I feel like these two are just made for one another. However, this is not necessarily a brand new release. To certain extents, this is once again a reissue and a second opportunity for people to collect certain figures that they may have missed out on. For me in particular, it would definitely have to be that Merciless figure, because when it comes to Batman Who Laughs here, if I'm not mistaken, this is probably, what, rendition number 4 or so? I almost want to be safe in assuming that it's version number 4 that we've gotten of Batman Who Laughs from the DC Multiverse line. Because if I take him and bring him a little closer, you'll notice that it's most certainly around the physique, the build, the tooling, and specifically the look of the limbs that is very, very familiar. You should find familiar should you have been collecting the McFarlane toy line ever since they acquired the license in 2020 and started to divulge these things out. And so one of the earlier takes that McFarlane brought us was the Batman Who Laughs, because naturally it's horror themed. It's going to have an awful lot of leather and buckles and straps and chains and an awful lot of details that is pretty much at home. It's pretty much par for the course with McFarlane as far as what their specialties lie. And this specific rendition of the Batman Who Laughs, which is now decked out in his knight armor as opposed to the original look, is no exception. However, it's interesting to note that the majority, like I mentioned before, the majority of the limbs, as far as the legs, the texture work for the pants, and of course the straps on the boots, the little bit of laces right there, as well as some of the buckles and the straps going on right here around the gauntlets that pretty much make up the spikes that are iconic to Batman right there, are pretty much one-to-one the same as prior incarnations of Batman Who Laughs. The reason for why I don't have any other versions to kind of bring out here is because, quite honestly, I'm a little lazy to pull out the only Batman Who Laughs that I personally do have in my collection, with the 3 Robins on the Chains set, and it's in storage, and I don't want to pull that whole thing out just for comparison. Just note that that's really where the similarities kind of end as far as this version of Batman Who Laughs with the other 3 versions, which, like I mentioned already once, is the one that's included with the Robins. The other one is, funny enough, the one that comes with the Build a Merciless piece with the wings and the little exposed abdomen piece. And then the other one, second to that, is also part of a Build-A-Figure, or I should technically say Build-A-Vehicle, which is that little rebirth Batmobile. I gotta be honest, what happened to the days that McFarlane was doing Build-A-Vehicles? I know that they're not to scale, they're pretty much Hot Wheels size, but there's a little bit of a novelty there, and I kind of wish I would have gotten in there before they, for lack of a better term, discontinued that entire idea and just kind of focused on building figures. But I guess from a pragmatic standpoint, it was the right direction to go into versus the ones of the vehicles. But at the same time, it would have been nice to have gotten a little mini DC Rebirth Batmobile to have been included as part of that set. So here, fast forward a few years later, and you technically have another Batman Who Laughs, but at least this time you get a slight overhaul when it comes to the torso piece to give us what is more or less a different looking outfit. And along with that, you'll also notice that they kind of applied certain paint applications that are a little bit more on the lightish gray, lightish bluish tint to the surface scatter here of the texture work on the pants as well as the sleeves to then match the look of the torso here, which in my opinion I kind of like a little bit better, probably only because I feel like I've seen that Batman Who Laughs outfit with the straps on the torso and kind of coiling on the side here of the shoulders just a little too frequently, that a nice little change of pace that feels a bit more medieval, feels a bit more like he's a king, a little Lord of the Rings, which is not going to be my only reference I'm going to mention here in a little while, is a breath of fresh air regarding the Batman Who Laughs, because that's kind of what appealed to me having this guy included in here, as far as the texture work happening here on the torso, the double bat symbol, if that even makes kind of sense, which is partially broken here on the center part of the chest emblem, and then the buckles kind of holding the entire Dracula looking cape, which has not only the very elongated collar here, but you'll notice it's made out of rubber as opposed to soft goods. However, to play a little bit of devil's advocate, no pun intended, kind of embedded there, it would have to be that if there was a more contemporary figure to utilize rubber instead of felt goods for the cape, it would most definitely be a leather-clad character like the Batman Who Laughs here. The only thing that I'm kind of curious about is whether or not it would have been in the cards to have had a wire embedded into the rubber. I don't know if at some point, whether it be McFarlane or hell any other toy company, would entertain the idea of including wires with rubberized capes. But if they wanted to be a trendsetter, McFarlane, I'm just saying, even outside of the DC license, I'm pretty certain that Spawn, if anything, could be the ideal character to have a rubberized cape, but still have some kind of wiring or some kind of articulation embedded into the cape, especially considering that Spawn has a pretty long-ass cape that he literally uses as a function, as a power, throughout his run in the comics and even in some other mediums. So that would be pretty dope and a nice little idea, and I would have liked to have that been kind of spearheaded a little bit with Batman Who Laughs here, because outside of that, you do get just that slight little bit of feeling when it comes to the tooling of the arms and the torso, especially around the torso area, where if you squeeze a little bit, you'll notice that you definitely get that vibe similar to those older 2021 figures, where it's a little hollowed out in the center around the abdominal area as well as the top part of the chest, where you can tell that they simply just took out his preceding outfit and gave him a brand new torso piece to emulate not only the very large buckle right there in the center, the spikes on the skirt, as well as this little part. Again, the texture work is immaculate considering that this is something that McFarlane is really strong at. And on that note, I really love this head sculpt. Granted, it's nothing too unlike the previous Batman Who Laughs sculpts as far as the smiling teeth right there, the spikes on the headband, as well as the two ears coming off of it. But of course, they included these extra spikes here towards the front and just grafted it onto them to make them look a little Sauron-esque. That's the other Lord of the Rings reference I was going to make. But apart from that, if anything, I kind of like how much more solid and really lined up the paint applications for the teeth, the gums, and the yellowing happening in there is versus some prior Batman Who Laughs that we gotten a little older, because they were utilizing a little bit of older paint apps. I just wish that they would have taken some chances, some creative liberties with the hands, because they're completely all white. And I do like that the gestures on the hands are pretty on character for the Batman Who Laughs, since they're all clawed up, and I do like the sculpting of the nails. But they're completely all white as far as the paint apps. Kind of wish that they would have taken some liberties as far as applying maybe some blood, dirt, grime, something just kind of give it a little bit of character, a little bit of personality, especially since, like I said, the majority of the rest of the figure feels a little bit on the throwback side, kind of calling back to those older figures that are not only utilizing older sculpts, but also older articulation. The head is on a ball joint that is able to rotate 360, just mind the collar because you are gonna have to like tilt it in a certain direction to get that to happen versus the collar. It's a little on the frustrating side, but to alleviate that a little bit, there's actually a little bit of nudging. It's not full articulation, but there's some slight movement in terms of tilting motion, front, back, center, and left to right from the bottom of the neck. So I think that's actually kind of cool that is still incorporated somewhat there. The arms, on the other hand, are pretty standard, able to rotate the full 360 no problem, as well as extend off to the sides. Just mind a little bit of that top part of the cape that is kind of encroaching on top of it, but it is flexible, and they glued it on the top of the shoulder piece as opposed to the actual shoulder part of the arm. And then it almost kind of feels like there's a little bit of butterfly motion, but it's just ever so slightly nudging side to side, front and center, up and down. So it's kind of a butterfly, but not really. It's really when we get to the biceps that I remember that this is quite, in fact, a bulk of the 2021 buck of that original Batman Who Laughs, because you'll notice that the bicep, though it does rotate the full 360 no problem, is a complete horizontal cut versus the cupping sort of design that more contemporary McFarlane figures utilize. So that definitely was a throwback to those early on DC Multiverse figures. Nonetheless, though, you do get two elbow joints that can fully bend all the way up, and then of course a ball joint at the wrist that fully allow the hand to rotate horizontally, as well as being able to move up and down, inside and outwards. Now, unfortunately, due to the way that this overall torso piece is designed, there's practically no mid-torso articulation. You can kind of feel like there's a little bit of a movement happening with the joint inside, especially considering that I mentioned before it feels a little hollowed out. But it just kind of bends ever so slightly, but because of the outfit, it just kind of retracts back into its original position. So no real movement to be found there or articulation to help out any kind of posability. Same thing with the waist. You'll notice that it's a bit ratcheted and can technically rotate the full 360, but outside of that, there's not any other favors that it's going to be able to really do due to the way that this sort of kind of skirt guard piece is sort of designed. And this skirt piece is also going to have some implications on the top leg joints. As far as flexing the legs upwards, you'll notice that it's kind of a little bit limited. It gets to about that point, but then it starts to retract just a little bit by the smallest of touches there because of this skirt piece. Same thing goes for flexing the leg towards the back like so, and then definitely extension off towards the sides, where you'll notice that it's pretty much stopped at the 45-degree angle. It's not able to do the even splits due to this skirt piece that is sculpted like so. Thankfully, not much has changed as far as the knee joints being able to bend all the way up at the 2 points. The ankle joint is on a ball joint, so it's able to flex the foot downwards like so, about that far, upwards that far, and then the full 360 rotation, as well as the toes being able to flex upwards about that far. So pretty standard issue as far as some of these older figures, these older bucks, but at the same time, we are in a time where some refinement could have been utilized to not only help out the aura that, as the kids like to say, emanating from the Batman Who Laughs, but on top of that, also help out with a little bit of better posability to do much of the heavy lifting for the presence of Batman Who Laughs, considering that this guy is pretty barren as far as accessories are concerned, because for this particular version included in this 2-pack, it's really about it. That's it. This is it for the Batman Who Laughs. He doesn't come with any other bonuses, no accessories, no weapons, no nothing, as opposed to the prior renditions of the character, whether it be the Build-A-Figure. Obviously, it's come with the Build-A-Figure pieces, but even those guys came with like you got the guy with the angel wings, you got the guy that's standalone, but at the same time, he still came with a dagger, a sickle, or a little, pickaxe type thing. And then you even have the one with like the little sits, however you pronounce it, which is technically not a DC Multiverse figure, but rather a Mortal Kombat version of the Batman Who Laughs incarnation, that specific skin that he had in that game. Even that guy came with some bonus weapons, and it all the more makes me wish that the way McFarlane makes his munition packs for guns, I kind of wish that he would do something like that, but for bladed weapons. Just imagine a set dedicated for swords, cleavers, katanas, those poles that come with like the knives at the end that they utilize in battle. Like quite an awful lot of opportunity there, both for collectors to beef up their collection and also a nice little extra set of side of cash, side of change for McFarlane on that front. Now, the Merciless, on the other hand, is pretty much a brand new figure for me, to the point where you can't even fit him in the frame. That's crazy. But at the same time, this guy right here is pretty sick looking and is frankly one of the more appealing factors of the 2 set that made me want to pick it up, because I completely, like I mentioned, missed out on that Build-A-Figure version of both versions of the original Batman Who Laughs. My only kind of exposure to the figure version was that 4-pack with the 3 Robins. So I missed out on the DC Rebirth vehicle as well as the version that came with the Merciless pieces. And so now I get the opportunity to not get just another incarnation of Batman Who Laughs into my collection, but then finally the Merciless figure completely pre-built, so no extra assembly is required on your part. And then on top of that, hot take here, but as far as color scheming is concerned, you know my bias. I love red. I love red and black things. Now, granted, this doesn't really have too much going on as far as black accents. If anything, it kind of favors more so on the grayish chrome side, with a few of the touches on the skull there on the belt, as well as the chains kind of coiling from within it, as well as, of course, the little Ares, Wonder Woman, whatever you want to call it, symbol embedded with the bat symbol towards the back there on the chest. But it's really the red, the crimson bloody red, that is really doing it for me. And in my opinion, is probably the better color scheme. I actually kind of prefer this incarnation as opposed to the chromey teal that he had going on for that Build-A-Figure version. So in my opinion, the way that the armor sculpted out combined with the red is really doing it for me, as far as really selling me on the badass nature, the cool factor that McFarlane's always talking about, that to me really did warrant a reissue with this guy. And this is ultimately the argumentative factor as to why it is that sometimes these collector's editions reissues definitely have a place in the business right now. I don't know if they're going to be there in the future, especially with how things are kind of getting talked about with McFarlane and the DC license. But for now, this is probably a really well strategic move. And I feel like Merciless here is probably one of the best cases for that, because the solid build quality to the way that everything is sculpted from a maquette style to the armor, you can, again, kind of tell that this is McFarlane in their wheelhouse. As far as sculpting out the armor plates for the shins here, that are kind of scaled to one another and kind of overlapping the one underneath, as far as the way that even the feet kind of feel with these little like boots and shoes, armorized shoes, that to me really stand out, as far as the kneecaps, the way that everything's just combined together to give it this very Dracula-esque kind of aesthetic, and specifically the Bram Stoker Dracula movie by Francis Ford Coppola. That's the first thing that I thought about when I saw this armor, was the original armor at the beginning of that Gary Oldman movie. That was the first image in my mind, and if you ask me, that is pretty fitting considering the slight horror motif that we got going on right here. So this really does do it for me as far as the actual presentation from a visual standpoint. Kind of witnessing this guy up on the shelf, I would say that this is definitely a very solid outing when it comes to the sculpt work. And granted, it's an older sculpt because it's throwing it back to that initial Build-A-Figure, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Or at least don't fix the presentation as far as the sculpting is concerned. Maybe the articulation and the actual tooling of the body could have been a little better refined, because at the end of the day, I do still have this strange little feel at the tip of my fingers that does bring me back to reality, and noting that this is, at the end of the day, still a Build-A-Figure. There's still times where a few of the limbs connected to the torso and even the head sculpt and a little bit of the chest piece here at the top feels like it's been pre-assembled from an existing Build-A-Figure wave. So it never feels like it was a figure tooled from the factory. It feels like it was still developed at a piecemeal perspective and then kind of assembled after the fact, if that makes any kind of sense. And that's still well illustrated by the little bit of separation you have going on here on the thigh. You'll notice that amongst this little sculpt lining of the armor, you'll notice that it's a little bit more indented here on the thigh, and that's precisely where the legs still connect between the two Build-A-Figure pieces. So Still take note that this is still a Build-A-Figure. You're still holding a Build-A-Figure in your hand when dealing with this guy, but at least it's a really well-tooled, well-sculpted, and pretty solid one. Albeit, it's probably the one that's responsible for not only the $80 price tag, but also probably the reason for why you technically don't have any secondary accessories to go with Batman Who Laughs over there, because most of the plastic allocation is probably going towards here. And this is probably where, despite my compelling argument for reissues, it's also kind of debating the price point, because it's probably one of those circumstances where they say, hey, you got a collector's edition number 4, but here is your price. You have to include as much plastic inside of that price as possible. And once they got this guy down as far as like allocation, they looked at the tallies and went, well, if you put in Batman Who Laughs, well, you could do that, but he's not going to come with the accessories because you already used up all your funding on this guy. And that is a little bit of a bummer, but at the same time, I'm willing to swallow the pill, considering, like I said, the badassery of the sculpting here with the chains, the little skirt, tattered clothing happening here along the skirt piece, the skirt guard, if you will, as well as the little bit of a fur, I don't want to call it a cape, but whatever he's got going on, the little mane he's got here towards the backside, and most specifically the shoulder plates that are encompassing the shoulders with a little bit of even chainmail texture happening inside of the shoulders there, that to me just kind of give it a little textured detail of life, so to speak. And then of course you have that devilish head sculpt right there with the helmet, the teeth, the orange eyes, and then of course the bat wings representing ears is super badass. Now, I know that technically this is not the default head that he comes with out of the box, but for the posterity of the review, that's pretty much what I included, because one thing to kind of sweeten the deal as far as this 2-pack is a bonus older Bruce Wayne head sculpt. I'm gotta be honest, this is awesome, despite the fact that him combined with the red suit makes him look like a very gothic Santa Claus. That's pretty much one of the first things that kind of popped into my brain when I saw the reveal. But the sculpting behind the alternate head here for Bruce Wayne with regards to the hair, the grayed out paint applications, the beard, and even the added detail of his cutout eye there. If you kind of take a look right there, you have one regular eye, but then the other eye is completely sealed off, poked out. I gotta be honest, it can't get any more badass looking than this. And I might be wrong, but I don't think even the Build-A-Figure Merciless version from that Build-A-Figure wave didn't come with an included head. Now, he technically did come prior to this release with the bonus sword piece right here, which is really well done as far as the paint applications for the gold, the little bit of airbrush on the hilt, and then, of course, the way that everything's kind of chiseled and embedded into the blade itself. And it's also a pretty solid, sturdy piece. It's made out of rubber, but it does flex, but it's not, it never feels like it's going to warp or feels cheap or just, breakable or anything like that. It feels pretty solid, but we've seen this guy before. This guy did get included, I think, with like the headpiece in that Build-A-Figure wave, whereas the Bruce Wayne, I could be wrong, but I don't think this guy ever saw the light of day. So kind of incorporating the function of swappable heads between these two guys, that's pretty cool, but I do sense a little bit of favoritism here towards Merciless because he technically comes with 2 accessories. I don't know exactly why that couldn't have been the case for Batman Who Laughs. And I know what you're going to say because it's literally staring at us in the face down below. But before I get to that, one thing to note is that as cool as this sword is and as intuitive as it is to put into at least one of his hands, I kind of offhand sort of wish, no pun intended there, kind of offhand wish that he could have been able to hold it in both of his hands, but it's practically impossible considering that still dealing with the notion that he is a Build-A-Figure and considering how stocky he is with his armor as far as the sculpt work, as far as everything being so bulky and so massive and larger than life, his articulation is a little on the stagnant side, to the point where if someone were to make the argument that he is pretty much a posable statue, I wouldn't really contest it all that much, because you're already dealing with some problems as far as the head joint is concerned. For example, the helmeted head is able to technically nudge side to side, but it doesn't really tilt up and down all that greatly because you're dealing with an awful lot of limitations and conflicts with the earpieces. The little Batwing earpieces are kind of coming into conflict a little bit with the shoulder guards as well as the collar and the top part right there. And if I was to do a bit of a head swap here by removing the head and fitting on the, technically speaking, the default head, which was the Bruce Wayne one, the articulation then gets even more limited because he can definitely tilt downwards pretty good because of the extra space you got inside of the collar. But looking up is a little bit more limited due to not only having less space towards the back here inside of the collar, but also the hair kind of comes into conflict and stops it even earlier. And then you could practically almost forget about rotation because he can kind of nudge side to side, as you can kind of see it right there. But doing so would pretty much start the process of removing the head. So he's a little bit on the sensitive side because if you tilt it and kind of slide and rotate it all the way around, 9 times out of 10, the head is going to start coming off. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a problem. That's probably one of the reasons for why we never got this Bruce Wayne head originally in the first place, because there was probably some QC problems to begin with right there. So, as long as you kind of keep it stagnant to just look badass as he is right there, then you're not going to have a problem. But articulation, you're not going to find it terribly fluid right about right there. A similar thing kind of happens with the shoulders, because even though he technically does have arm joints that can fully rotate the arms 360 degrees, you'll notice that he's going to come into conflict with the shoulder pieces. Now, thankfully, the shoulder pieces themselves are also articulated. You can rotate them towards the back and out of the way, like so. That is pretty badass. They're on ball joints on top of the shoulders. They can technically come off, so if you want to remove them completely, you can do so as well. But I like to just kind of veer them off to the side like so, and allow the arm to fully rotate in place. Just know that if you don't do that extra step, there's a really good chance that these shoulder plates are going to simply just pop off on their own volition. So getting them out of the way, you can rotate the arm like so, no problem. Extend it off towards the side via the hinge inside, no problem like so. And even a little bit of butterfly movement inside of the dumbbell joint, found a little bit right there. So that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, we start to get into some mega figure territory when it comes to some points of articulation, specifically the elbows, because he technically has a hinge that allows the elbow to bend. I almost want to say 90 degrees, but not even that. I think it stops shy of 90 degrees, just about right there, due to the way that this overall gauntlet piece is sculpted. But then on top of that, it's only one joint. If you want an extra joint, you can technically find a swivel just above that. So you have an elbow swivel that can rotate that right there, but not much found in the way of bending. You do have ball joints for the wrist that allow the hand to rotate the full 360, as well as bend inwards and outwards ever so slightly, but can't really extend off towards the outside via this wrist joint because of the way that this, again, guard is sculpted and just kind of stops it in the way. So again, it's almost like it's fighting itself. Torso articulation is actually pretty nice on the other hand, because you do have a mid-torso that can fully rotate the full 360, as well as slightly crunch down towards the bottom, actually a pretty surprising amount, and even extend slightly upwards and a slightly side to side. So pretty flexible there. Not much in the way of crunching on the waist in any kind of direction. However, you are allowed further 360 movement on the waist as well, despite the very garish skirt piece and guard that's kind of encapsulating the majority of the belt right there. So that's pretty surprising. But much like Batman Who Laughs over here, he's got these skirt belt pieces that are going to limit a little bit of the top leg joints. So flexing the leg upwards can only go about that far before you can start seeing it not only retract a little bit, but you notice how squeaky and kind of, I don't want to say cheap, but it just doesn't feel right. And again, it kind of lends into that Build-A-Figure feel that I was mentioning a little earlier, especially flexing it towards the back like so, or even, of course, side to side. Though, unlike Batman Who Laughs, these pieces here on the side of the belt are a bit more on the flexible side due to the rubberized plastic that it's made out of, so it's able to flex a little bit more fluidly, and therefore giving you a pretty much a 180-degree even split right there. So that's pretty interesting that older evil Bruce is able to do the split still. However, much like the elbows, you only get one joint that is able to bend the knee about the even 90-degree angle right about right there. So if you want further articulation, you technically have a shin swivel or a knee swivel found just below that kind of connects to the boot. So you can notice right there, although it's a little rough on both knees. So I don't know if this was like a brand new practice, but if This was their argument to never do this kind of articulation again. I can definitely buy into it because it does not feel good. If anything, I'm gonna barely utilize it to begin with. And then right below that, you're gonna have ball joints for the ankles that can fully bend the ankle downwards like so, a pretty good amount. And thankfully, they cut out a little bit of the ankle guard right here above the armor piece to allow better flexing towards the top. But still, rotation is a little unpleasant due to the way that it's all kind of cupped and assembled together via the armaments that's happening right there on the sides. But on the bright side, despite being very pointy and being very rigid, the toes are able to bend almost a full 90-degree angle, as you can kind of see it right there. So surprising in certain aspects, but pretty disappointing and limiting in others. That kind of remind me why I often try not to get too high of an expectation when it comes to articulation for a Build-A-Figure. You know, whether it be Bane or this guy, and when I say Bane, I mean both the Dark Knight Trilogy version and even the Last Knight version, because at times you can tell that sometimes articulation gets kind of lost a little bit in the sauce in regards to design, because it's almost like we're looking at the individual pieces more so than the sum of their parts. So a Batman Who Laughs with no accessories, a Build-A-Figure that is well sculpted but also is still just a Build-A-Figure repainted, albeit with some cool distinctions as far as the sculpt work. You get the alternate headpiece, that's a nice little sweet bonus. But the bonus didn't stop there. You then get the answer as to why it is that this guy's priced at $80, and maybe the argument as to why Batman Who Laughs didn't come with anything else as far as accessories is because of what you see before you, which is this giant communion. Okay, I'm not gonna go there. It is, of course, the giant display base, as opposed to having your traditional two circular DC black bases, the very generic ones. This collector's edition 2-pack that is not labeled as such does come with the 2 collector's edition cards for each character, but instead of giving us your traditional diorama base, they opted for this giant disc that, yes, it is in fact designed, painted, and sculpted immaculately. It is really badass as far as having the little illustration of the Batman Who Laughs there at the center, the logo for Dark Knight's Metal down at the bottom that is completely embossed or embedded, however you want to call it, so you can actually feel it in a 3D sense. And then kind of circumventing the rim of the design along with like little skulls and demonic images, you of course get the emblems for the different Batman from Dark Knight's Metal. You know, some that have to do with Batman himself, the Green Lantern or Black Lantern, whatever you want to call it, Aquaman, and then of course the Merciless with the Ares Wonder Woman symbol right there. So I do love that little aesthetic. I do like that it feels wholly unique. And if you look a little carefully, you'll notice that, yes, you have your basic 2 pegs there at the center for these 2 figures that he comes bundled with. But if you look a little carefully, you'll notice that you even have additional pegs in other parts of the bases, specifically around certain emblems. You'll notice that you have some pegs kind of hiding a little bit in the corner towards the outside of the rim there. And I like that that's pretty much implying that this base is not just designed for these 2 guys, but practically the remainder of the Dark Knight's Metal figures that have been released thus far. So that's pretty awesome that you can kind of mix and match and kind of incorporate them all into one singular display. I just wish that the quality of the display itself was a little nicer, because it technically comes split up into 3 different pieces out of the box, and though the assembly is pretty much self-explanatory, it doesn't really gel together all that greatly. It feels just snug enough that when you kind of pull the base across a flat surface, they'll hold together, but if you pick it up and hold it like literally with one hand, it'll start coming apart. It'll start bending and kind of clasping into itself, that I kind of wish that there was a different method to clipping the pieces together and would hold a little bit much more firmly. A la Spin Master, whenever they require assembly for certain vehicles and things like that, I kind of wish it would pop a little bit more so like that, as opposed to just pieces that just kind of fit together but never really hold on to one another. And that's a huge detriment on a base like this that you can tell is supposed to stay flat here, which I know it's a base, is supposed to do that, but at the same time I kind of wish that it was a bit more collector friendly when it comes to moving things about, because I could tell that that could be a recipe for disaster should you be in a home where you kind of want to change up your display a little bit more. And I know that ever so often you're gonna have collectors wanting to pick this up and it's gonna completely fall apart. That, and then the filament for the plastic in and of itself is not necessarily the most solid. It feels a little on the hollowed outside, so it looks cool, but it doesn't necessarily feel the greatest. So there's a part of me that I almost wish that some kind of customizer or a modder, somebody in the mod community would maybe like add some kind of filament towards the bottom to give it an added bit of weight, maybe like a felt layer so that it kind of grazes on the surface of a display or a shelf or a detolf a little nicer. And then on top of that, maybe find a way to kind of combine the pieces a bit more congruently so that it feels not only snug, but it also doesn't feel like it's just going to fall apart in your hands. And with that, that is pretty much what I like to call the current season of reissues for McFarlane Toys, where I started to pick up on this running theme of previously released figures that may have been a little bit on the scattered side in terms of supply or release or exclusivity behind a particular retailer, such and such. And McFarlane decided to kind of pick up a little bit of that slack, not just because of second opportunities for collectors to pick up on these figures without paying for scalper prices, but also to kind of cut their losses should the license be nearing its expiration date, and to make sure that we're not bleeding a little bit too much from a marketable standpoint, from a business standpoint, to be like, okay, let me make sure that I go out swinging and not only invest in brand new figures that have never seen the light of day. I'm talking about Absolute Batman, at least for me, Absolute Batman, and maybe an Arkham Knight or Arkham Asylum Batmobile McFarlane, I'm just saying. But while they're at it, also give opportunities for certain collectors to make sure to complete that checkbox, fill in that vacancy in their collection that they've been meaning to fill for quite some time. But at the same time, considering things are getting more expensive, not only with collecting, not only with hobbies, but also with just living, at least being able to cut out the middleman of the form of somebody on eBay, somebody on Mercari, etc., and being able to get a variation of that initial release and get us closer to that completion state of our collection without breaking the bank. And that's commendable. Not every company is going to be able to do that. I mean, I can think of certain competitors that we will like to see kind of dip their toes in the reissue game, but whenever they do, they completely overhaul the figure, or they cut out accessories that wouldn't have cost them anything to have included from years past, and for some reason they up the price. It's almost like McDonald's. They raise the price, but the burger gets smaller for some reason. At least with McFarlane here, yes, some things initially look like they're a little bit expensive, and that last collector's edition 2-pack definitely can make a compelling argument for fluctuating on the price, considering it's $80. But you do get something you've never seen before in the form of the base or the alternate Bruce Wayne head sculpt. And for someone like me who missed out on Merciless, now I have him with an even better color scheme. So there's opportunity there. And whether it be with a toy fair, a Comic-Con, or whatever McFarlane Toy Show episodes they got coming down the pipeline, if we're getting more reissues, more collector's edition 2-packs that give people who missed out on certain figures a second chance, a revitalization of their collection without having to resort to scalper prices, to be honest, it kind of makes me think of that one meme, one of the few good things to come out of Rise of Skywalker. I don't care if McFarlane wins. I just want the scalpers to lose. That goddamn thing. Anyways, that's pretty much the bottom line, the one key takeaway I got from this overall thematic video. And I want to hear from you guys. What do you guys feel about this current trend that McFarlane is kind of dipping into as far as reissues, remasters, re-releases, and kind of giving the collector market a second chance at owning some of these figures without going to extortive prices as far as the scalpers, and getting at least a different outlet for certain characters that they may have missed out on? Whatever the case may be, whatever kind of arguments you guys have, let me know down below in the comment section. And while you guys are down there, hit the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this very lengthy review and you managed to stick all the way to the very end for it. Or if you didn't like it, hit the thumbs down. And as always, take care and stay humble. Peace.